I'm Scott Alexander, and in this video I'll be continuing my analysis of Maimonides' 26 Propositions of Aristotelian Philosophy, which is located in his introduction to Volume 2 of his Guide of the Perplexed. This series is based on my commentary essay on that introduction, which is part of my essay-style commentary on each chapter of the guide. In this video, I'll talk about what I call his propositions of causation, which are propositions 17 through 20. I'll briefly introduce the whole concept of causation and go through the propositions and explain how Maimonides will use them in his grand proof for the existence of God in the next chapter of the guide. The propositions are about causation and the mover, that's proposition 17, the change agent, proposition 18, contingency, proposition 19, and necessity, proposition 20. The general importance of the concept of causation for Maimonides was set forth in his proposition 17, which is the longest of the 26 propositions. The mover, proposition 17. Everything that moves must have some agent that moves it. It is either from without, as a stone set in motion by the hand, or from within, as a living being composed of its moving agent and the thing moved. Thus, when it dies, and its mover, the soul, has left the body, the thing moved remains momentarily in the same condition as before, but does not move in the manner it moved previously. An animal's moving agent is concealed and imperceptible, so it seems as though it moved itself without a mover. But while anything that has a mover in it is generally said that it moves itself, that just means that the moving force of the moved being exists in the composite whole. Maimonides used this proposition to show that since everything that moves must have a mover must cause the motion of the cosmic sphere. Maimonides thought that this was true because motion does not cause itself. This proposition contains three component ideas. The first focuses on the separate mover that starts any motion and continues it. That is to say, there must be a mover separate from the moved object. The second idea is that this mover is either internal or external to the moved object. And thirdly, the moved object is either inanimate or animate. Now, the problem is going to arise in the case of animate beings because it seemed like they caused their own motion. Philosophers had called them self-moving. Aristotelians, however, asserted that they are not entirely responsible for their own motion. Aristotle believed this because he was convinced that all motion was divisible. We encountered this idea in Proposition 7. The Aristotelians scorned the idea that the moved being could be its own mover. They argued that pure self-motion was absurd because the agent and the changed object would be identical, as though, for example, a doctor would be his own patient. The Aristotelians also argued that our soul wills the motion. That is to say that the soul is separate from the body, that it accompanies it. And that's why Maimonides said that when any being moves, though we commonly call it self-moving, we mean that there's always a separate mover. Maimonides now turns to the basic element of causation, which is the change agent. Proposition 18. Everything that passes from potentiality to actuality has a separate external change agent. Were it within, with no obstacle preventing this passage, it would never be potential, but always be actualizing itself. and if it were within, and at a certain time that obstacle was removed, the agent that removed the obstacle would undoubtedly be described as the cause of the actualization of that potential. Recognize what this means. Hebrew, haven ze. Let's take this complicated proposition apart. Maimonides will use this proposition to show that whenever anything passes from a state of potentiality to a state of actualization, there must be a cause for that transition. That causative agent must be separate from and external to the changing object. This is the change agent. There's a change agent at each level of the causal chain together with its changed object. This is true no matter how far down the causal chain you go, but no such change is infinite. You must ultimately, he says in the next chapter, quote, at last arrive at a cause of this transition, which is constant and admits of no potentiality whatever. That would be God. However, the proposition wants us to understand that an object may remain in a state of unrealized potentiality due to any of three factors. The first factor is that there may be an internal obstacle. Or secondly, it could be a general external condition disrupting the realization of the potential, or it could be a change in the nature of the agent. The proposition wants us to understand that the change agent does not always act directly upon the object of change. Direct action is not required. All the change agent need do is remove the obstacle, change the external condition, or change itself. If this is true in the case of nature, it's all the more valid in the case of God. God can effect change without a direct positive act, merely by willing the conditions that will lead to the removal of the internal obstacle or the external condition. The proposition goes on to assert everything that passes from potentiality to actuality has a separate external change agent. Were it within, with no obstacle preventing this passage, it would never be potential, but always be actualizing itself. But we do not see this in nature. We can illustrate the point with the following example. A tree has an internal agent of change, which is its natural form. The tree would never stop growing if this agent were unobstructed. But certain external conditions, like the onset of winter, prevent such continual growth. The springtime sun removes this wintry obstruction. But without those environmental factors, the tree would never stop growing due to the unobstructed force of its natural form. But simply by removing the obstacle, the change agent can allow the natural form to do its work. The proposition wants us to understand that change is different from motion. The change agent, unlike the mover, does not have to act positively and directly as when a mover acts to topple a row of dominoes. The change agent need only involve the removal of the external condition, or remove the internal obstacle, or change the agent's relation to the object. These do not require direct action to effectuate change, and if that's the case in nature, it follows that God also doesn't require direct action to effectuate change. The implication which Maimonides demands that we draw is that God can act without changing himself. He causes change without changing. We have no idea how God does this, though. That's why Maimonides makes the formulaic statement at the end of the proposition, usually translated as note this or understand this, Hebrew, haven ze. Maimonides wants us to take such signposts very seriously. I rendered it as recognize what this means, in order to emphasize that this divine act is a mystery of creation, Maisa Bereshit. It's also meant to emphasize that this proposition was designed to forestall the eternalists' objection to creation ex nihilo, that God would have to change to make such a change as creation. The eternalists, like Aristotle, argued that since God never changes, the universe also must be uncreated, eternal, and unchanged. So, by Aristotle, if God were a creator, God would not be God. Maimonides uses this proposition to reject the eternalists' argument. Just as the change agent in nature need not undergo change to cause the creation of the new, so God need not change to effectuate his will. Moreover, he writes, quote, "We are utterly ignorant of the ways and methods of divine wisdom." And, quote, "The term will is used homonymously of man's will and the will of God, there being no comparison whatever between God's will and that of man." Maimonides now reflects on the consequences of this system of motion and causation. The next propositions, 19 and 20, reflect the most profound understanding of the relationship between God and everything else that we will find in these 26 propositions. We call this the principle of sufficient reason. We're going to start with the doctrine of contingency, which is a critical element of this doctrine of sufficient reason. Contingency, proposition 19. A thing that has a cause for its existence has only a possibility of existence with respect to itself. That is to say, it only exists if its causes are present. But if they're not present, if they have ceased to be, or if the causal relationship necessary for the thing's existence changes, it cannot exist. Maimonides will use this proposition in the next chapter to show that although all contingent existences have immediate causes, their proximate and indirect causes all must lead back to God. Thus, Maimonides divides existences in two. Number one, those contingent beings, those contingent possible beings, which exist because of something else. And secondly, God, who exists only because of himself alone. Thus, there are only two things in or out of the universe, God and the contingent existences, which could not exist without him. All contingent beings ultimately depend for their existence on his absolute existence. This doctrine is Avicenna's version of the cosmological proof for God, which became German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz's famous principle of sufficient reason of the year 1714, which states, quote, "Why is there something rather than nothing? The sufficient reason is found in a substance, which is a necessary being, bearing the reason for its existence in itself." Maimonides thinks that this proposition is true because whenever we see that something has come to exist, we recognize that it must have prior causes. It follows that anything that has prior causes for its existence has only contingent existence with respect to itself. Its existence is conditioned upon something else. Therefore, we look for the one unconditioned being which is the sufficient reason for all other things. However, with respect to its own nature and nature's God, the created being exists necessarily. It must exist because it's part of God's plan. But even though things must be the way they are, their existence with respect to themselves is entirely dependent on God and the continued existence of those causes and conditions. Now, since the contingent object only exists if its causes are present, the second half of the proposition turns to what happens if they're not present. It reads regarding those causes, quote, "But if they're not present, if they have ceased to be, or if the causal relationship necessary for the thing's existence changes, it cannot exist." So, for instance, it's only because of the sun that we experience daylight on Earth. But if we were to suppose that it was not present, that is to say, if there never was a sun, we'd have to conclude that there never would have been any daylight. If the sun was absent, for example, if it existed but was eclipsed, the sunlight would not continue. And if, finally, the relationship changes, so for example, the sun turned its rays away from the earth, then there would again be no light on the earth. This example illustrates the three negative conditions implied by the proposition. Number one, that motion would not exist if its causes were never present, or two, if they happen to be absent, or three, if it existed in a changed relationship to the subject of motion. In those three cases, the sun could not bestow its light on the earth since it has no internal cause of motion. There must be a sufficient reason for its continued rotation. That sufficient reason can only ultimately be divine. This doctrine of sufficient reason is the same doctrine Maimonides famously announced in the first Mishnah of his Mishneh Torah. Here is that first Mishnah. Quote, "It is the most basic of basic principles and the pillar of wisdom to know that there is an existent that existed before everything else and that he created everything that there is. Everything in the skies, on the ground, and in between exists only because of the truth of his existence. If it were supposed that the Creator did not exist, then nothing else would, for nothing can exist independently of the Creator." When Maimonides uses the phrase, "the truth of his existence," in that Mishneh Torah extract, he means God's necessary, absolute existence. Turning to the next proposition, Proposition 20, we see that Maimonides restated this principle of sufficient reason, this time from the point of view of God. Necessity. Proposition 20. A thing which has in itself necessity of existence cannot have for its existence any cause whatever. Again, we see Maimonides using Avicenna's distinction between necessary and contingent things as part of his elaborate proof of God's existence. Only now we're focusing on divine necessity, not on all the other contingent things as we did in the last proposition. Starting with the recognition that everything beside God might or might not exist, we then look for the sources and causes for those other beings. As we go up the chain, we see that it must begin with a final cause whose existence is absolute to avoid infinite regress. Of this principle, Maimonides wrote in the next chapter, quote, "This is a proof the correctness of which is not doubted, disputed, or rejected, except by those who have no knowledge of the method of proof." And this proof does indeed go beyond any deficiencies that we may think weaken proofs from design or from causation or even ontological proofs, like proofs from God's nature alone, as in Anselm's ontological proof. And that's because it goes back to the most fundamental question: why does the world exist at all? This proof doesn't presuppose design or orderliness. Confronted with a world of conditioned objects and occurrences, we search for something unconditioned to avoid endless regress. This forces our acknowledgement of the one being whose existence is necessary, who is absolute being, who is the unconditioned basis for all conditioned things. Now, this understanding of the divine being is still not the God of religion, but it's superior to what has been called the God of the philosophers, who was conceived as a mere designer who left off once he was done designing. And that's because it's transcendent, unlike Aristotle's unmoved mover, which is still part of the universe. And that's why Maimonides states the essence of this principle of sufficient reason in the all-important first Mishnah of his Mishneh Torah. Proposition 20 ends by saying of the necessary existent that it, quote, cannot have for its existence any cause whatever. What this means is that this transcendent being, God, is entirely causeless, which means that he's beyond any causal chain or any cause, and has within him no embryonic causes, nor any assembly of causes, whether actual, potential, material, incorporeal, manifest, or notional. For there's nothing that influences, prescribes, or explains his existence. And all of that is why the proposition ends with the vague statement that this being has, quote, no cause for its existence under any condition, velo b'shum panim. This catch-all is meant to warn that we may not suppose that any particular state or special circumstances gave rise to this being. Unlike anything else, his existence is identical to his essence. And that's why he's called the necessarily existent with respect to himself. The power that Maimonides attributes to the necessary being is unconditioned by anything else. By contrast, everything else is a conditioned subject of God's unconditioned necessary existence and volition. Even the necessary fall of the last domino must look back to an unconditioned and unmoved mover at the commencement of all motion. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. Thank you very much for listening. In the next video in this series, I'll talk about the propositions of form and matter, which are propositions 21 through 25. You may contact me at scottmalexander@rcn.com with any comments, questions, or criticism. Please click on the description panel for this talk on YouTube to see links to any documents mentioned in this video. Please visit my website, Maimonides-guide.com, to see my commentary essays on each chapter of Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed. It's currently completed through the entire first volume and now includes my commentary on the introduction to the second volume. On that website, you can also find associated essays I've written, podcasts, videos, and important links. And of course, please like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe, and hit the YouTube notification bell. Thank you.